In Meiji, Japan, smiling at the wrong person could get you killed. Not metaphorically, not socially, actually killed. And understanding why requires a pretty quick tour through one of the most elaborately layered honor systems ever constructed, a system so deeply embedded in daily life that abolishing it by law in 1868 barely made a dent. This is the story of what a smile meant, who it threatened, and why a reflex that started with lacquered black teeth is still visible on Japanese streets today. Don't forget to subscribe to Porque Now for more stories like this one. Let's start with the basics. In Meiji, Japan, a smile was not the universal signal of warmth and goodwill it tends to be in, say, a Walmart greeting. A smile was a complicated social instrument, loaded with implications depending on who you were smiling at, and what the smile looked like. Get it wrong, and you weren't just being rude. You were potentially signaling weakness, low breeding, emotional instability, or, in the wrong context with the wrong person, outright disrespect towards someone who had, until very recently, the legal right to kill you for it. To understand why a smile could get you into that much trouble, you have to understand what came immediately before the Meiji era. Japan in the Edo period, which ran from 1603 to 1868, operated under one of the most rigidly stratified social systems in human history. At the top sat the samurai class, roughly 5 to 7% of the population, who held essentially unlimited social authority over everyone below them. Commoners, peasants, craftsmen, merchants, were required to bow in front of samurai and to avoid direct eye contact entirely. That was not a polite suggestion. That was the law. And the law had teeth. Samurai operated under a privilege called kiri-sute gomen, which translates roughly as authorization to cut and leave the body. What this meant in practice was that a samurai had the legal right to strike down a commoner who he felt had compromised his honor. No trial, no warning, no second chances, just the sword and a report to the local magistrate afterward. The rules around what counted as a disrespectful offense were not exactly spelled out in a pamphlet. The samurai's sense of honor, haji in Japanese, was the measuring stick, and it was a very sensitive one. One of the most frequently cited examples involves a commoner who spotted a flea on a samurai's back and helpfully called it out. The samurai cut him down. The reasoning? By comparing a noble warrior to an animal host for parasites, the man had committed an unforgivable insult. The flea was a technicality. The point was that anything that made a samurai look diminished, ridiculous, or less than fully composed could theoretically justify a lethal response. In that context, the wide, unguarded grin, an expression of open emotion, of having your guard down, of being visibly and freely delighted, was something you kept very far from your face when samurai were in the vicinity. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 officially abolished the samurai class and, with it, the formal right of kiri-sute gomen. The new government declared all social classes equal under law. They gave everyone surnames. They dissolved the old class system. Former samurai were now legally just people. But here's the thing about social conditioning. It doesn't stop existing the moment someone passes a law. The generation that grew up under the Edo system was still alive. The reflexes were still there. The instinct to compose your face, to keep your expression neutral, to not broadcast your inner state to strangers, that didn't disappear in 1868. It got embedded deeper, and the reason it got embedded so deep goes straight back to one of the most influential texts published during the entire Meiji period, Inazo Nitobe's Bushido, The Soul of Japan, written in 1899. Nitobe was a fascinating figure, born into a samurai family in 1862, educated largely in English, trained at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and a convert to Quakerism. He wrote Bushido in English while recovering from exhaustion in California, and the book was addressed primarily to Western readers who wanted to understand Japan. In it, he laid out what he called the essential virtues of the samurai: rectitude, courage, benevolence, politeness, sincerity, honor, loyalty, and framed the entire code in terms Western audiences would recognize, drawing parallels with European chivalry. The book was a massive hit. Theodore Roosevelt loved it so much he had copies distributed to friends. It was eventually translated into 7 languages. And crucially, it got picked up by the Japanese government and nationalists, who used it to build a mythology of Japanese identity around samurai values, even though by then the samurai class had been gone for 30 years. What Nitobe wrote about composure is where things get relevant for this story. In his interpretation of Bushido, the ideal warrior was one who could face any adversity, including death, with a completely calm, untroubled face. He quoted an earlier samurai writer who described this quality as tranquility in repose. A brave man was never surprised, never rattled, never taken off guard by anything. His face gave nothing away. This was not just a warrior's discipline. Nitobe argued it had spread through all of Japanese society, becoming the model for what it meant to be a composed, dignified person. In that framework, openly smiling at a stranger, showing all your teeth, broadcasting your happiness to the street, was basically the facial expression equivalent of walking around with your shirt untucked while loudly telling people how you feel. It signaled that your inner life was ungoverned. And in a culture where the suppression of external emotion was considered a mark of maturity and character, that was not a compliment. There was also a very specific, very practical reason why Japanese women in particular developed a habit of covering their mouths when they smiled. And it has to do with one of the strangest and most visually jarring beauty customs ever to get banned by royal decree. For centuries before and during the Edo period, married women in Japan practiced something called ohaguro. They dyed their teeth black. The dye was made from iron filings soaked in vinegar and tea, producing a solution called kanemizu, which was applied to the teeth daily and produced a deep, lacquered black color. The practice dated back to at least the Kofun period, around 250 CE. By the Edo period, black teeth were considered a mark of beauty, maturity, and loyalty, a visual signal that a woman was married and socially established. In the aesthetic system of the time, shiny white teeth were actually the unsettling option. They were associated with wild animals, demons, and oni, supernatural creatures depicted with large, white fangs. Pitch black teeth were refined. White teeth were feral. Western visitors who arrived in Japan in the 1850s and 1860s, as the country's self-imposed isolation began to end, had a strong reaction to ohaguro, and it was not a positive one. They described it as an abhorrent Japanese custom that disfigured women. Women who, several accounts note, the visitors had considered attractive right up until the moment those women smiled. Commodore Matthew Perry, who sailed into Japan in 1853 and effectively forced the country open to trade, reportedly said something to the effect of, "Japanese women seem educated and capable. I genuinely cannot understand why they would paint their teeth black." He was not being complimentary. The pressure to conform to Western beauty standards was immediate and significant. In 1870, the Meiji government officially banned ohaguro for civil servants and nobility. By 1873, after Empress Shoken appeared in public with white teeth, which was a carefully staged political statement, the cultural tide had permanently turned. Within a generation, black teeth went from a mark of elegance to a sign of being old-fashioned and embarrassingly behind the times. Here is where it gets interesting for the history of the smile. One common theory among Japanese social historians is that the habit of covering the mouth while laughing, still visible in Japanese women today, developed precisely because of ohaguro. Women who were self-conscious about their black teeth began covering their mouths as a reflex. And that reflex, that gesture of discretion around the smile, got absorbed into the broader social code around emotional restraint and never fully left. So what started as a practical habit for people with lacquered teeth became, over time, a generalized norm about not broadcasting your mouth to the world. One tradition outlasted the other by about a century. Not a bad run for something that started as dental camouflage. The broader cultural logic behind all of this is worth sitting with for a moment. Psychologists studying cross-cultural differences in emotional expression, notably Paul Ekman in the 1970s, found something fascinating in their research involving American and Japanese participants. When both groups were shown stress-inducing films while alone in a room, they produced nearly identical facial expressions. But when an observer was present in the room, the Japanese participants consistently masked their negative emotions with neutral or positive expressions. The Americans continued displaying their feelings openly. The interpretation. The Japanese weren't less emotional. They had simply internalized a more complete set of social rules about when it was appropriate to let your face say something in public. This isn't a uniquely Japanese phenomenon. Every culture has display rules. But Japan had built theirs around a particular value: the suppression of visible emotion as a sign of respect for the group, for harmony, for the people around you who didn't ask to be involved in your feelings. What that looked like in practice on the streets of Meiji, Tokyo, was a city full of people with very controlled faces navigating a completely chaotic social moment. The old rules about class deference were technically gone. The new rules were still being invented. Nobody was entirely sure what you were supposed to do with your expression when you passed someone of ambiguous social status on the street, or when you encountered one of the thousands of foreign advisors the government had imported to help modernize the country. Engineers, doctors, military trainers, teachers, all walking around in Western clothes, looking visibly delighted and horrifying everyone with the width of their smiles. One Tokyo newspaper in the early 1880s actually suggested that rickshaw men should stop working without shirts, and that bathhouses should put screens in their entryways so that Japan would not be laughed at by foreigners. The fear of being laughed at, of being seen as undignified, as backward, as less than composed, was running in both directions at once. Japan was modernizing at extraordinary speed and trying to maintain the face of a culture that had always valued not showing too much face. The collision between Japanese emotional restraint and Western expressiveness produced some genuinely bewildered accounts on both sides. Western visitors to Japan in the late 19th century consistently noted the impassive faces of the people they encountered, and tended to interpret the lack of visible emotion as either coldness, inscrutability, or some vague quality they called Oriental mystery. They were reading the faces wrong. What they were actually seeing was a culture that had spent centuries developing a very sophisticated distinction between what you feel and what you show, and that considered the second thing a social responsibility, not a personal option. A Japanese person who broadcast their happiness loudly and openly in a formal context wasn't being warm, they were being inconsiderate. They were involving everyone around them in a private emotional state that had nothing to do with those people. Sort of like being on a quiet train and putting your phone on speaker. Nobody asked for that. The word that captures this logic most precisely is wa, harmony. It sits at the center of Japanese social interaction and has for a very long time. The idea is that the group's cohesion and comfort takes precedence over individual expression. Following the unspoken rules, controlling your face, modulating your voice, reading the room and responding to what the room needs rather than what you feel, is not repression. It's consideration. It's the social contract. And in Meiji, Japan, that contract was being renegotiated in real time, because the old hierarchy that had given everyone their assigned place and their assigned set of behavioral rules was officially dissolved. The samurai were now legally commoners. The commoners were now legally equal to everyone. Nobody was quite sure what the new display rules were supposed to be, so the default was to keep the old ones, at least on your face. This created a specific kind of social absurdity that is genuinely worth pausing on. The Meiji government was simultaneously telling people that class distinctions no longer existed and importing thousands of Western advisors who smiled at strangers, laughed loudly in public, and generally conducted themselves as if their emotional state was everybody's business. Japan hired over 3,000 foreign experts, called Oyatoi Gai Kokujin, or hired foreigners, to help modernize everything from the military to the postal system to the railway network. These men walked through cities that have been built around the idea that showing your teeth to someone you didn't know was a social hazard, grinning cheerfully at everything. The culture shock ran in both directions. Japanese observers found the Western smile aggressive and slightly unhinged. Western observers found Japanese restraint impenetrable and slightly sinister. Both groups were essentially looking at each other's display rules and concluding, something is wrong with these people. The government's response to this clash was, in many ways, characteristically Meiji, extremely practical and slightly absurd. Rather than trying to change how people actually felt or how they actually interacted in private, The focus was on managing appearances in public, particularly in front of foreign eyes. This is where the newspapers started publishing advice about rickshaw men not working shirtless and bathhouses installing screens at their entrances. The concern wasn't modesty in any abstract sense. It was specifically about not being laughed at by Westerners. Japan was acutely aware that it was being watched and judged by Western powers who were deciding whether the country was civilized enough to be treated as an equal on the international stage. Looking composed was not vanity, it was geopolitics. The smile, in this context, became an unusually loaded symbol. For the samurai-descended classes, which still made up the bulk of the government and military in the early Meiji period, former samurai didn't disappear. They became politicians, industrialists, and army officers. Visible cheerfulness was associated with a lack of seriousness. Nitobe Inazo put it directly in his Bushido. A truly brave man is never taken by surprise. Nothing disturbs the equanimity of his spirit. Tranquility in all circumstances was the goal. A smile was acceptable in the right context, intimate settings, among close friends, in the lower-stakes environments of entertainment and leisure. But the unguarded grin in a formal or public context was the face of someone who hadn't mastered themselves. And in a culture where self-mastery was the supreme virtue, that was a serious indictment. Smiling freely at people you didn't know was basically a way of announcing, "I have very little emotional discipline, and I would like everyone to know about it." There was also a class dimension to all of this that complicates the story considerably. While the samurai tradition valued stoic composure as a matter of honor and identity, the commoner classes had their own, very different relationship with visible emotion, and it was considerably less buttoned up. Edo period Tokyo, then called Edo, had a vibrant commoner culture built around theater, comedy, street entertainment, and a style of humor called rakugo, in which a single performer seated on a cushion voiced multiple characters in absurdist comic narratives. People laughed loudly at rakugo. They laughed loudly at kabuki. They laughed loudly in the market districts and the entertainment quarters. The emotional restraint associated with the samurai class was not the universal Japanese condition. It was a class marker, a signal of elevated status, and it filtered down unevenly through the rest of society. Pre-Meiji era, people in Japan were actually more willing to express negative emotions and more freewheeling with their opinions in general. Tokyo people in particular had a reputation for being belligerent and loose-tongued. The image of universal Japanese stoicism is partly a post-war invention. What the Meiji period did was take the samurai model of emotional control and, through a combination of national ideology, public education, and the government's very deliberate promotion of Bushido as a core component of Japanese identity, push it outward until it started to look like a national characteristic rather than a class one. The Imperial Rescript on Education, issued in 1890, embedded samurai values of loyalty, filial piety, and self-sacrifice into the national school curriculum. Children were being taught, explicitly, that the correct emotional orientation was one of composure, discipline, and subordination of personal feeling to collective duty. The smile was not on the syllabus. Meanwhile, the physical transformation of the smile itself was undergoing its own strange journey. After the government banned ohaguro in 1870, and Empress Shoken appeared with white teeth in 1873, something unexpected happened. People who had spent their entire lives covering their mouths when they smiled, out of habit, out of self-consciousness about the black dye, kept covering them. The gesture had become decoupled from its original function. It was no longer about hiding the color of your teeth. It was about discretion, about not presenting your open mouth to the world, about the same principle of emotional concealment that underpinned the whole system. One researcher's theory holds that Japanese women cover their mouths while laughing to this day, partly because of this historical chain. A practice that started as dental camouflage turned into a social norm about restraint, and the norm outlived the reason for it by over 100 years. Which is honestly a more impressive lifespan than most beauty trends. Looking at you, low-rise jeans. The Meiji period also produced a genuinely fascinating split in how smiling was understood as a signal. Research in cross-cultural psychology, including work by psychologist David Matsumoto, who has studied Japanese and American emotional display rules extensively, has found that in Japanese culture, a smile does not primarily mean happiness, it means social management. Japanese participants in studies consistently smile more than Americans in situations of embarrassment, discomfort, or mild distress, using the smile as a tool to maintain harmony, to communicate that everything is fine even when it isn't, to avoid burdening the people around them with an unpleasant emotional reality. The American smile says, "I am happy, look at me." The Japanese smile can say any number of things, most of them having nothing to do with happiness. It can mean, "I am embarrassed." It can mean, "This situation is uncomfortable and I am managing it." It can mean, "I disagree with you, but I am not going to say so." Reading it correctly requires context, relationship, and a fair amount of practice. Getting it wrong, particularly if you were a foreigner interpreting a polite Japanese smile as genuine enthusiasm, could lead to some extremely confusing outcomes. Researchers at Hokkaido University, led by psychologist Masaki Yuki, have identified something interesting about the difference between how Japanese and American people read faces. Americans tend to focus on the mouth when assessing someone's emotional state, because the mouth is where American expressions happen most visibly. Japanese people tend to focus on the eyes because the eyes are harder to control. They're more likely to tell you what someone is actually feeling as opposed to what they've decided to show. The practical implication is that the Japanese emoticon for a happy face is eyes curved upward, while the American version is a curved mouth with neutral eyes. Both cultures invented the same communication tool and immediately built it around completely different parts of the face. Nobody planned that. It's just what happens when you spend centuries reading different signals. All of this brings the story to a question that Westerners observing Japan in the 1870s and 1880s were genuinely confused by. If the smile could be dangerous, if visible happiness was associated with low self-mastery, if the whole system rewarded a composed face, what did genuine, sincere joy look like? And the answer is, mostly private. Joy in Meiji Japan, for people in formal or public contexts, was something experienced and expressed within appropriate containers. The theater was one. The yosei, small vaudeville venues where manzai comedy performers worked the crowd, was another. The bathhouse, the sake merchant. The carefully maintained social spaces where the rules about display were different, where laughter was expected and the face could do what it wanted. The Japanese approach to emotional expression was never about suppressing feeling. It was about reading the room correctly and understanding which spaces were designed to contain which expressions. The street was not that space. The formal meeting was not that space. In the wrong space, a wide, open smile was not friendliness. It was a failure to understand where you were. The legacy of all this is surprisingly visible today. Japan consistently scores among the lowest of any country on measures of spontaneous smiling at strangers, a fact that generates enormous amounts of confused tourist content about whether Japanese people are unfriendly. They are not. They are following a set of display rules that have been calibrated over centuries, shaped by a samurai honor culture, reinforced by a nationalist educational system, and hardened by a particularly brutal 20th century in which the idea of keeping your feelings private became tangled up with the national project of rebuilding from catastrophic defeat. The modern Japanese city is full of people experiencing a full range of human emotions and making careful, considered decisions about which ones to show, to whom, and when. Which, if you think about it, is not so different from what everyone does. The Japanese version is just more deliberate, more historically loaded, and considerably less likely to involve someone grinning at you in a supermarket. So which part of this surprised you the most? The black teeth that started a reflex lasting over a century? The government banning smiles, not for cultural reasons, but to avoid looking bad in front of foreigners? Or the fact that a flea on someone's coat could, in the right decade, be a matter of life and death? Leave it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Porque Now for more stories about the completely bizarre logic hiding inside things we think we understand.